The envelope arrived at Lucky Luciano's desk at exactly midnight, delivered by a messenger who disappeared before anyone could ask questions. Inside was a single photograph, Luciano's mother leaving church that morning, circled in red ink. No note, no demands, just the image and a lipstick kiss mark in the corner, Stephanie St. Clair's signature. The most powerful mobster in America stared at that photograph for 10 minutes without speaking, his hands shaking with something his men had never seen before. Fear. Because Queenie had just sent a message that couldn't be misunderstood, she knew where everyone he loved slept at night. Drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from? Here's a controversial question that'll explode this section. Can a woman who built an empire on illegal gambling be called a hero for protecting her community from worse criminals? Hit subscribe because we're exposing the untold story of the woman who controlled Harlem when the Mafia couldn't, who made the NYPD look the other way, and who proved that the most dangerous gangster in 1930s New York wasn't Italian, wasn't male, and wasn't playing by anyone's rules but her own. This is Stephanie St. Clair's story, and it's absolutely wild. Stephanie St. Clair arrived in Harlem in 1912 with $10 in her pocket and a French Caribbean accent that made people underestimate her intelligence. She was 24, an immigrant from Martinique, and she'd learned one crucial lesson. Money is power, and power belongs to whoever's smart enough to take it. Harlem in 1912 was opportunity and exploitation combined. The Great Migration was bringing thousands of black Americans from the South, all desperate for work and housing. White landlords charged them triple rent, white employers paid half wages, and white gangsters ran the numbers racket, an illegal lottery where poor people bet pennies hoping to win dollars. Stephanie watched this ecosystem for 3 months before deciding she could do it better. The numbers game was simple. Players picked a 3-digit number and placed bets from a penny to $1. If their number hit, they'd win at 600 to 1 odds. The house always won long term, but the dream kept people playing. Stephanie started running numbers out of a beauty salon on 140th Street. But she had advantages white gangsters didn't. She spoke the community's language, literally and figuratively. She understood that Harlem residents weren't just marks. They were neighbors who deserved respect. She paid out winnings immediately, in full, no excuses. Revolutionary. The white-run numbers banks always found reasons not to pay. Stephanie's operation paid every legitimate win every time. Word spread fast. She hired from the community, giving jobs to people who couldn't get work elsewhere because of skin color. Numbers runners, collectors, bookkeepers, all black, all earning more than any legitimate job available. She was building organized crime from outside, but a parallel economy from inside. Within 5 years, Stephanie controlled 40 runners and was pulling in over $200,000 annually, approximately $4 million today. She bought property under various names. She funded schools and churches. She paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them. She wasn't Robin Hood. She was running a criminal enterprise. But she understood something fundamental. Loyalty can't be bought, only earned. And she was earning it, one paid-out winning slip at a time. But success attracted attention. By 1928, Stephanie's operation was so large, the Italian Mafia couldn't ignore it. Dutch Schultz, the violent psychopath controlling bootlegging in the Bronx, started looking at Harlem's numbers racket with greedy eyes, and Dutch Schultz didn't ask permission. He took what he wanted through violence and intimidation. The war was coming. Everyone in Harlem knew it. The only question was whether Queenie, as Stephanie had become known, could survive against an opponent with 10 times her resources and 0 moral boundaries. What nobody knew was that Stephanie St. Clair had been preparing for this war since arriving in America, and she had weapons Dutch Schultz couldn't see coming. The first shot wasn't fired with a gun, it was fired with the New York District Attorney's Office. In 1929, Stephanie St. Clair did something unthinkable for a black woman running an illegal operation. She went public. She bought a full-page ad in the Amsterdam News, Harlem's most influential black newspaper. The headline, "Police Corruption in Harlem, a Public Accounting." Below it, she'd listed names, badge numbers, and weekly payoff amounts for 32 NYPD officers taking bribes to protect white-run numbers operations while harassing black-owned businesses. The scandal was explosive. The police commissioner called for her arrest. The mayor demanded investigation. But Stephanie's move was brilliant. She'd kept meticulous records. Every payoff, every date, every officer. She had receipts and had distributed copies to every major newspaper before publishing. The NYPD couldn't arrest her without validating her accusations. They were trapped. But Dutch Schultz wasn't constrained by political optics. 3 days after the ad ran, 2 of Stephanie's top runners were found beaten nearly to death in an alley. The message was clear: go to war with the Italians, and people die. Stephanie's response was calculated and cold. She sent a message. For every one of her people harmed, she'd expose another corrupt officer. For every business vandalized, she'd release documents showing which politicians took mob money. You want to play dirty? I've been documenting your dirt for a decade. Let's see who runs out of secrets first. This was unprecedented. Gangsters didn't threaten exposure. They threatened violence. But Stephanie understood what Dutch Schultz didn't. She had nothing to lose. She was already operating outside the law, already black in 1920s America, which meant the system was designed to destroy her anyway. But Schultz had politicians to protect, relationships to maintain, a reputation that couldn't survive public humiliation. She was weaponizing her vulnerability while exploiting his respectability. And it was working. For 6 months, tense stalemate. Schultz couldn't move without risking exposure. Stephanie couldn't expand without triggering violence. They circled like sharks, waiting for an opening. That opening came in March 1931, when Prohibition was dying and the Italian Mafia needed new revenue streams. Dutch Schultz decided Harlem's numbers racket was worth the risk. He was wrong. Schultz sent 20 enforcers into Harlem. Take over every numbers bank by force. Within a week, they'd seized most white-owned operations. Those operators folded immediately. But when Schultz's men showed up at Stephanie's headquarters, they found 40 armed men and women, barricaded inside with a sign reading, "Come in if you're ready to die today." The enforcers retreated. They hadn't expected armed resistance, especially not armed black resistance. Racist assumptions didn't allow for the possibility that black criminals could be as organized as white ones. Schultz sent more men. Stephanie sent more guns. Harlem was becoming a war zone, and the NYPD had to choose: protect the Italian mobsters or stay out. They chose to stay out. Not because they respected Stephanie, but because she'd made helping Schultz too costly. Every cop who intervened risked being named in her next exposé. So the police looked away. And in that vacuum, Stephanie St. Clair proved something that would echo through organized crime history. Violence isn't the only form of power, and sometimes the person willing to burn everything down is more dangerous than the person with the biggest army. But Schultz had one more card to play, one that would force Stephanie into a decision defining her legacy and nearly costing her everything. Dutch Schultz's final strategy was brutal in its simplicity. If he couldn't take Stephanie's operation by force, he'd destroy the community's trust in her. He started flooding Harlem with rigged numbers games, operations that looked legitimate but never paid out. When people won, Schultz's operators claimed slips were fraudulent, numbers were wrong, bets weren't recorded. Within weeks, hundreds who'd scraped together pennies found themselves cheated. And here's the insidious part. Schultz's men told every cheated player the same lie. Madame St. Clair changed the rules. She got rich and stopped caring about the little people. It was psychological warfare aimed at Stephanie's greatest asset, her reputation. If people stopped trusting her, her entire operation would collapse without a shot fired. Stephanie's response was characteristically bold. She liquidated assets, sold properties, called in loans, emptied bank accounts, and did something unprecedented. She paid out every single winning slip from the previous month, whether they'd been placed with her operation or Schultz's rigged games. She stood on the corner of 125th and Lenox for 3 days straight, with a table, a lockbox full of cash, and a ledger. Anyone who'd won and not been paid could present their slip, any slip from any operator, and Stephanie would pay what they were owed. It cost her over $100,000. It nearly bankrupted her. But it did something more valuable. It showed Harlem she was willing to sacrifice everything to keep her word. While Schultz proved he'd cheat anyone, Stephanie proved she'd pay anyone to maintain trust. The shift in community support was immediate and total. People stopped playing Schultz's games. They flocked back to Stephanie's runners. And more importantly, they started providing her intelligence. Where Schultz's men operated, which cops were on his payroll, which politicians took his money. Harlem had chosen its gangster, and it wasn't the violent white man with the Italian mob. It was the Caribbean woman who'd kept her promises even when it hurt. But Schultz wasn't done. In August 1931, he sent a message. Meet one-on-one, or I start killing people you care about. Not your runners, your friends, your family. It was a death trap. Everyone knew it. Schultz would never let Stephanie walk out alive, but if she refused, innocent people would die. Stephanie agreed to the meeting, set it for a restaurant in Little Italy, Schultz's territory, where he'd have every advantage. Her advisors thought she'd lost her mind, because Stephanie St. Clair had one more card to play, one she'd been holding since arriving in Harlem, waiting for the exact right moment. And that card was about to burn down Dutch Schultz's entire empire. The meeting was set for September 3rd, 1931, at Marconi's restaurant in Little Italy. Dutch Schultz arrived with 4 bodyguards, confident this would end with Stephanie surrendering or dead in the basement. Stephanie arrived alone, wearing an expensive dress, carrying only a small purse. Schultz's men searched her for weapons, found nothing. They escorted her to a private room where Schultz waited, wine on the table, gun visible in his holster. "You're either very brave or very stupid," Schultz said. "I'm neither, I'm strategic." She opened her purse, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. Schultz opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, his accountant meeting with IRS agents, his lawyer meeting with federal prosecutors, his top enforcer meeting with NYPD detectives, every meeting, every betrayal carefully documented. "Your organization has been infiltrated," Stephanie said calmly. "3 of your top people are cooperating with federal authorities. The IRS is building a tax evasion case that'll put you in prison for 20 years. And I know this because I'm the one who gave them the evidence to start investigating." Schultz's face went white. "You're bluffing. The IRS raid on your primary warehouse happens in exactly," she checked her watch, "45 minutes. If I'm bluffing, you have nothing to worry about." Schultz stood so fast his chair fell over. His bodyguards reached for weapons, but Stephanie remained seated, perfectly calm. "You can kill me right now," she said, "but my death triggers the release of every piece of evidence I've collected on your operation, every payoff, every murder, every deal. It all goes to the FBI, the IRS, the New York Times. You'll be the most investigated criminal in American history. Or," Schultz's voice shook with rage, "or you walk away from Harlem, permanently. You let me run my operation without interference, and I keep your secrets. You stay out of federal prison, keep your other businesses, maintain your reputation. All you lose is Harlem, which you never actually controlled anyway." The calculation played out on Schultz's face. He'd built an empire on violence, but Stephanie had just demonstrated something more powerful: information. She'd infiltrated his organization, documented his crimes, turned his own people against him, all while he'd been focused on street warfare. "You set this up from the beginning," Schultz said, realization dawning. "The public exposures, the resistance, it was all distraction while you gathered evidence. I learned a long time ago that the best way to win is to make your opponent think they're winning until the moment you destroy them. You thought you were hunting me. You were wrong." Schultz walked out, called off his Harlem operations, never directly challenged Stephanie St. Clair again, not because he respected her, but because she'd proven she could destroy him with a phone call. The war was over. Stephanie had won. Harlem's numbers racket remained in black hands, controlled by a black woman who'd outsmarted the Mafia through intelligence rather than violence. But here's what nobody knew. Stephanie's threat had been a calculated bluff. She had some evidence, but not nearly enough to guarantee prosecution. The IRS raid was happening, but based on an anonymous tip with just enough information to trigger investigation, not enough to guarantee results. If Schultz had called her bluff, she probably would have died in that restaurant, but she'd read him perfectly, understood that his paranoia would make him overestimate the threat. She'd won the war with a poker hand that wouldn't have survived scrutiny. But the victory was real, and it would last for years, until one person emerged who Stephanie hadn't anticipated, someone who would become her greatest ally and eventually her most dangerous complication, Bumpy Johnson. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson arrived in Harlem in 1919 as a 15-year-old kid running from a murder charge. By 1932, he was one of Stephanie's top enforcers, the muscle behind her numbers operation. Their relationship was complicated from the start. Bumpy was everything Stephanie wasn't. Male, American-born, comfortable with violence as a first resort. But he was also brilliant, loyal, and understood the game with sophistication that impressed even Stephanie. She mentored him, taught him the business side, how to keep books, launder money, build networks. He taught her the streets, which corners were valuable, which cops could be bought, which rivals needed watching. For years, they were the perfect partnership. Stephanie provided strategy and political connections. Bumpy provided enforcement and street credibility. Together, they built an empire that withstood challenges from Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, and every other mobster who thought Harlem was theirs. But in 1938, something shifted. Bumpy started making his own connections, building networks, developing relationships with Italian mobsters that Stephanie had explicitly forbidden. He was positioning himself for a future that didn't necessarily include her. Stephanie confronted him. "You're planning to take over my operation." Bumpy didn't deny it. "Times are changing. We need relationships with the Italians to survive the next decade. Those relationships will require compromises I won't make." "Then maybe you need to step back and let someone else make those decisions." It was the closest they'd come to an open break. Stephanie could have had Bumpy killed, but she recognized something that hurt to admit. He might be right. Her model, the independent black operation without Italian oversight, might not survive the 1940s. Bumpy's model, strategic partnership while maintaining independence, might be the only way forward. She made a decision defining her legacy. She stepped back, not out, but back. She let Bumpy take over day-to-day operations while maintaining her role as advisor. But stepping back gave her something she'd never had: time. Time to look at what she'd built, what it cost, what it accomplished. And time to confront a question she'd been avoiding. Was running a criminal empire the best way to protect her community, or just the only way available to a black woman in early 20th century America? The answer came in 1940, when Stephanie St. Clair did something shocking. She retired from the numbers racket entirely and devoted the rest of her life to activism and civil rights work. Her final act was characteristically bold. She wrote an open letter to the Amsterdam News titled "Confessions of a Numbers Queen," detailing her entire criminal career: the operations, the payoffs, the violence, the compromises. She named names, exposed corruption, admitted her own complicity. "I built an empire on the dreams and desperation of people who deserved better," she wrote. "I told myself I was protecting the community, but the truth is, I was profiting from their exclusion from legitimate opportunities." The real solution isn't better criminals. It's a society where people don't need criminals to access financial services or protection. The confession was simultaneously self-serving and revolutionary. She was admitting guilt while indicting the larger system, taking responsibility while demanding accountability from institutions that had created conditions for her empire to exist. The NYPD couldn't prosecute her. Too much time had passed, and frankly, her confession implicated so many officers and politicians that pursuing charges would expose more corruption than it punished. So Stephanie St. Clair walked away clean, retired to a comfortable life, and spent her remaining years fighting for civil rights and economic justice. She died in 1969 at 80, having lived long enough to see the Civil Rights Act pass, to see Harlem transform again, to see some of the economic barriers she'd exploited finally begin to break down. Her legacy is complicated. She was a criminal who built an empire on illegal gambling. She was also a black woman who accumulated power and wealth in an era when both were systematically denied. She exploited her community while protecting it. She worked outside the law while exposing corruption within it. History doesn't know what to do with Stephanie St. Clair. She doesn't fit the narrative of hero or villain. She was both and neither. A woman who understood that power doesn't care about morality, only about who's smart enough and ruthless enough to take it. And for 2 decades in Harlem, she took it, held it, and proved that the most dangerous gangster in New York didn't need to be Italian, male, or violent. She just needed to be smarter than everyone trying to stop her.